In this video, I have a discussion with Ron Pisaturo about his book, A Validation of Knowledge, a new objective theory of axioms, causality, meaning, propositions, mathematics, and induction. Now, the simplicity of this title, A Validation of Knowledge, is a little deceptive because what Ron means by this is something that might be simple but is very ambitious. It is a validation of all human knowledge, at least an attempt at that. Now, in order to achieve this ambitious goal, Ron's book presents a carefully ordered set of observations and reasoning steps, each building off of the last, each validating ideas which form the basis of the rest of our knowledge. Ideas such as existence, part, whole, consciousness, causality, and identity. Ron's order of development in philosophy differs radically from the order of OPAR or other objectivist works, and it seems to have a fundamentally different organizing principle. During this particular conversation, Ron and I focus on issues of proper inductive order and hierarchy. And although I'm still deciding whether or not I agree with the book as a whole, I can assure you that it contains novel insights at every turn and is very much worth reading. If it does succeed in its goal, it will form a powerful foundation of certain knowledge which we can use to base further inquiry on. And it will probably provide further benefits which at this point we can only dream of. So I encourage you to go to the link in the description and buy Ron's book on Amazon so you can decide for yourself whether he succeeds at validating knowledge. And now let's go over to the conversation with me and Ron.
So I wanted to ask you questions about your book, and my particular motivation is to understand the issue right now, at least for today, is to understand the issue of hierarchy better, especially as it appears in your book, and especially because as an objectivist, I noticed that your hierarchy is different from that of OPAR, which is and so
OPAR,
I'm interested.
now that people may be listening, that's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff.
Yeah, that's right. And I myself have noticed possible disagreements of my own with the OPAR hierarchy. And so I think this will be really fruitful to see what you have to offer here. So I have this list of questions in a particular order. Here's the first one. This is super.
You have a hierarchy of your questions.
I have what I would call a logical order of questions.
Okay.
That's what I would call it. You'll see what I mean in a moment, I think. So so your first question is, what do you take to be the motivation for validating knowledge? Yeah, why do this? And you already discussed this with Arshak. Okay, sorry, Arshak. Yeah, you already discussed it with him, but I have a particular take on this. So if you were to re-answer the question for our sake now, that would be good.
Oh, okay. Why do we do? So one reason that comes to mind is just simply we have to know that what we think we know is really knowledge, right? It's very possible that we might have made mistakes somewhere along the line of gathering our knowledge. There were many conclusions that we arrived at when we were very young, and we don't remember how we did it. So it's just very important to make sure that we're right? That's an important thing. And another part of it is that we do know that when we have knowledge in a good order, and whether that's a hierarchy or an order, right? Possibly to anticipate some of your questioning, it makes that corpus of knowledge more conducive for using it. And and acquiring, building the corpus, more knowledge. It also lets you know the range in which that knowledge can be applied, right? So, for instance, in your field, if we know that Newton's laws, this is like a tired example, but Newton's laws were validated in a certain ranges of measurement. We know that it's going to apply in the future within those ranges, but if we go outside those ranges, like to speed of light approximating speeds, something else might come into play, right? So those are just three parts of the answer right off the bat. Did I have a better answer in the book? You read it more recently than I did, so was there something else in there that
I don't remember. That this is actually kind of a better answer than at least what I remember from the book. So, I mean, I completely agree with this, especially because at least the way I take this is that it's not primarily to answer the skeptics. And this is something you said to Arshak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although that might be a nice, that's a nice side benefit for anyone who is drawn in by the skeptics. You can now help them not fall victim to the skeptics. Okay, so I'm basically, I had sub questions on this, but this is solid. So you've covered them all. So I'm just gonna move on to my second question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just thought of one more aspect of the same thing is, when we re-examine our hierarchy, and we'll get to what maybe you and I mean by hierarchy or an order, we often find that we can streamline the old hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
There may have been 30 steps we followed to get to a certain answer, but once we re-examine that question with more knowledge, we say, oh, I can do that in 3 steps.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah.
And it removes clutter from your corpus of knowledge, right?
Yeah. And that actually, I think, pertains a lot to my work. So I look forward to getting to that aspect in my logical order of questions.
Yeah. So, for instance, the historical way of doing things is a great way to look at, because it's a way that did work and provides lots of motivation step by step. But then you can conclude, well, it did not have to be that way, and it could be this simpler way.
Yeah. Since we're on the topic, I might as well go into it. That's a key part of my method of induction, which is or rather specifically my method of inductive systematization, where we reprove things, but we actually reprove things using a fictional narrative, emphasis on the word fictional. But it has to be a possible order of discovery. It has to be possible, and it has to follow correct inductive methods. And the history is a great guide to writing this fiction. I even write in the characters names that kind of are similar to the characters of history. Like instead of Galileo, I call him Salviati, because that's basically what Galileo called himself in his dialogues. Anyway, and I see this as a way of avoiding issues like the one Harriman ran into when writing The Logical Leap. John McCaskey criticized particular historical inaccuracies. And I'm not even that interested in finding out whether it was a real historical inaccuracy or not, but let's just pretend it was. Let's just say, yeah, sure, and by the way, reviewing Harriman's work carefully, there's historical inaccuracies. I already know there's historical inaccuracies, but the thing is that Harriman was essentializing. The problem is he didn't tell us that's what he was doing. So this is why I emphasize the fiction aspect. I am not trying to produce a history. I'm trying to produce a streamlined hierarchy, as I think you would put it. That's not quite the words I use, but to put it in your language, I use a different language as we'll get to, but like that's what it sounds like. We're on the same page there.
Yeah, and to take examples from other subjects like mathematics or arithmetic, even uh, a subject in which people must have made discoveries in prehistoric times. All we can do is conjecture how that order went. I mean, you can find some, Stone Age tribe today somewhere and see how they did it, but a lot of that is going to have to be conjecture. And one thing I tried to do in my development of mathematics was to try to conjecture how primitive men could have come up with ideas such as counting, right, and number, and some very measurement, very basic ideas.
Yeah, and actually, I should mention that reading your papers on that before they got integrated into this new book, reading your papers on the induction of mathematics had a huge influence on my own inductions. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay. In a positive way, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yes. There's actually certain things I would do differently, but I think we're about to get into that based on that we're about to discuss hierarchy.
Yeah.
There's certain things.
And that's to your point. When you revisit a hierarchy, you may point out things that maybe I did not see or understand, or you can make improvements on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that kind of work can enhance our understanding of mathematics, right?
Yeah, I think so. So
that goes to the motivation for examining hierarchy.
Yes.
And when you come down to it, as Peikoff has mentioned, at least spoken, that logic is another perspective on order. Logic basically is putting things in a certain order. And if you want to think logically, you have to understand hierarchy. That's really the most basic thinking method. These days when educators try to talk about, how do we teach what they call critical thinking, and a lot of that tends to be looking for errors and being skeptical. But the aspect of thinking they often overlook, unfortunately, is this idea of hierarchy. It's not just finding fault in what's been presented in the past, or finding errors in an argument. It's knowing how to construct a valid argument, which is putting things in order, which is thinking logically, which is putting things in a hierarchy.
Yeah, all thinking requires that particular order for its validation.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. And this is why teaching kids geometry is so critical once they're ready for it, at least like proofs in geometry. So I used to tutor, and one thing that would really clarify things for some people is I would tell them, look, I know we're studying shapes and that seems really random, but the point of this isn't really shapes. It's to teach you how to think. And it turns, if we can teach you, we're just teaching you about shapes so that you learn how to think generally, because shapes are easy, basically. And so in the future, you'll be able to, and that sets the stage for them to understand what the point of the whole class is. Because otherwise, a lot of times proofs, with a lot of kids are looking at these proofs and they're just like, what the hell am I looking at? What's the point of any of this stuff? We're just going through these steps. And if they don't grasp the point, then it seems Kafkaesque to them, basically.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it just like what it like. Man, was Archimedes just kind of some kind of like triangle pervert? Like he was just really, but
Uh-huh.
that's not why we're focusing on this. Okay, so let's see. So now part of the motivation I want to know about is how specifically does your differing logical order end up enabling your theory of induction in ways that other logical orders, especially say OPAR, don't allow for that? Could you have made your theory of induction by just taking the OPAR hierarchy and saying, okay, now I'm just going to continue from there? Or did you need this different hierarchy in order to get to your theory of induction?
Well, I think that's a great question. And just extemporare, two thoughts just popped into my head. So I'll try to take each one of them. The first one is I'm not convinced by Peikoff's order in validating causality as it's done in the book, in his book.
Mm-hmm.
So right from the get-go, I would be stymied because I just don't think that's a valid validation, an actual
Yeah.
validation, and it basically is a kind of inference from the law of identity. It's a law of identity applied to action, is basically what he says. So if it has a
Mm-hmm.
certain identity, that means it's got to act in a certain way. And I think that's arm waving. I don't think that's
Okay.
I don't think it's valid. And Peikoff himself, I think, has said other things in other forms. In his course in objectivism through induction, he basically said such an approach just doesn't, I don't know whether he used the word rationalistic, but you have to look at reality and many, many facts. And he has also related a story at least once, maybe several times, of when he asked Ayn Rand, how do we know the law of causality, right? She said, just take a walk and just see
Yeah.
it. It's everywhere, right? And
Yeah.
then he told how he saw it's everywhere. So there's that inductive nature. So right from the get-go, I I I thought that a better starting a more rigorous starting point was needed. So that's the first part. And what came out of that was also something that might be viewed as, well, I don't want to use the word heretical because I don't want to imply that objectivism is some kind of orthodoxy or religious doctrine, but something that's very much contrary, I think, to the general train of thinking in objectivism, is I broke causality into several parts. And I don't think, I haven't seen another thinker do that. They say, well, we have this law of causality, and some of them will say what's in OPAR, that it's just a corollary uh, of the law of identity. And then we have causality, just like we have the axioms before it. And we know it completely, it exists, and there we go. And others might say, well, we have to do what Ayn Rand said, is walk around and see it, that it's everywhere. And they say, oh, we know causality. And what I did instead is I broke it into three pieces. And each piece gives us more information culminating in the full-fledged law of causality that we know and love. So the first part of it was in just examining existence acting on my consciousness. That's in my judgment, and according to my theory, the fundamental form in which we know causality, we experience it. And that's the rock bottom veridical aspect of causality. We know that the thing is acting on me there's some kind of causal relation. So that's the first step. If you want to jump in, am I saying too much? Are you dying to?
No, no. So that's only your first step. I see.
That's
I
right.
actually have an objection to this first step, but let's hear the
Okay.
other steps. I'd be interested. I didn't realize from my first reading that this was only the first of several steps. So go ahead and tell me the other two steps.
Yeah. So that's that first step. The second step is to recognize that this causal interaction of reality acting on me is regular.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I know that is by the very fact that I perceive entities. You're thinking, so I'll let you
And
think.
entities means, and then remembering from your book, which I just reread this part this morning, and by entities, you specifically mean something that has persisting characteristics, and they're characteristics that persist across sense modalities. You know,
Yeah,
the particular, like this, I don't feel a border of this yo-yo out here. I feel it here in the same spot where I see the border of my finger touch the border
that's
of the
right.
yo-yo.
That's right.
So, yeah.
So the perception of entities tells us that reality acts on us causally in a regular way, and that tells us that causality is regular, and that gives it its connection to an identity. It's not just an ephemeral causal action of reality on me this moment and a different one the next moment. There is a localized part of reality, right? This object that acts on me in this consistent way to my touch, to my sight. As I rotate it in my hand, it also rotates in my sight, right? It's a part of the whole of my visual field. It's a part of everything I feel. There's some kind of persistence and consistency and distinctiveness, all aspects of identity that that I am aware of in the form of being aware of an entity. If there weren't that consistency, we would never perceive an entity. An entity is, by its definition, something that acts as a unit, causally as some kind of integrated unit. So the second step, getting back to of causality, is to realize that this causal relation that I knew just from existence acting on me in some way is has this kind of consistency and regularity. So that second step is this regularity. And the third step, actually, you can actually think of it as two different steps, but I kind of put it in the same step, is that this regularity will continue into the future.
Mm-hmm.
And also that this regularity exists not only from existence acting on my consciousness, but in the form of objects in existence acting on each other. So just as the wind, just as you push me and I fall down, if you push a chair, it'll fall down. You know, that 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 that. So for instance, if I go back to props here, what can I use as a prop? So not only does this act on my senses of sight and touch, but when this moves, when the calendar, the daytimer is not paying for an ad here, but when daytimer moves across, it's also moving this object, because it's holding that object up. So there's an interaction not only between these things in my consciousness, but there's an interaction between and among all the objects out there in the world. So that's the third step.
I see. So,
and there's a different method for knowing each of those. There's a different
A different
philosophical.
process of coming to know each of those.
Yeah, a different step in the logical argument. The first one is I'm aware of this existence and consciousness, and it's a kind of analysis, actually, of breaking down the elements of my my awareness of something, and I realize, oh, it's something that's there and something that's conscious of it. There's some kind of relation. Conscious of something implies a relation, right? And conscious of it acting on it's making me conscious of it. That's a causal statement. That's this first step. So it's a kind of analysis of any instance of perception or sensory awareness. The second step is just observing or taking note of all of the instances, the billions of instances in which these things are acting on my senses in a regular way. So that's just taking stock of the tremendous amount of data. And the third step, in that in chapter 8, which you, I guess, recently read, takes that information and actually adds probability theory to it so that I can form a probabilistic conclusion about entities acting on each other and continuing to act on each other and me in the future. So the first step is an analysis step. The second step is a taking stock of a tremendous amount of data. And the third step is a reasoning inductive step, employing aspects of probability theory that I presented.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. One thing I noticed, I actually wrote your hierarchy as best I could in my notes. And I noticed, and just in single words, existence, part, whole, consciousness, causality, multiplicity, identity. One thing that jumped out at me is that correct? Is that in fact the hierarchy?
No.
Oh, okay.
So here's the thing. I didn't listen fully to get every detail, but here's the amendment that I would make to this whole thing. And this goes to my theory of propositions. A list of concepts is not sufficient to arrive at or to retain an order of thinking. You need propositions. That's the whole reason. That's the main reason for propositions. Concepts are too broad. There's a spiral, right? We all know the spiral of knowledge. And to state that the principle of the spiral of knowledge in more precise terms is to say that our hierarchy of knowledge or our order of knowledge can be stated only in the form of propositions. And so we know a certain amount of a certain concept at the beginning, and then we learn certain things about further concepts, and then we spiral back.
Okay, yeah, more things are going in the file folder, but the thing,
that's right.
But like any one unit that's going into the folder at any one time is a proposition. It's not its own particular concept. And that squares nicely with your theory of meaning, which is that propositions are like concepts in that they have a set of omitted measurements, but because they're a set of concepts together, they are necessarily a narrower meaning than any one of the concepts that were put into that appear in the proposition.
Or of at least some one of they're narrower than some one concept in there. Yeah.
Any one of them, or some one of them.
Someone.
Okay. I'd have to think about that particular detail, but I think that's good for now. Okay.
So that's why, and I know, objectivists have argued and changed their minds about gee, what's the right order of concepts? Does volition go before,
That's
this?
okay. Yeah.
This is my answer to that whole conundrum is you're trying to use the wrong tool to solve the problem. Remember the spiral of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so, I know this much about this. I know this much about existence and consciousness and identity, and then I know something about causality, and then I learn more about a bunch of other things, and I even learn more. And again, this is contrary to the general objectivist line of thinking, is that the axioms are, you know them and you know everything about them at the beginning. I don't know whether that's actually a
Yeah,
statement.
pretty much. I think, yeah, that's at
Yeah.
least, Peikoff says something like that. You don't like additional facts don't add to your knowledge of the axioms. He says
Well,
something like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And see, with causality, I'm saying something contrary to that. And
Yeah.
I say some things contrary to that, even with the concepts of existence and identity. There's something about existence that starts at the very beginning, but for instance, the idea of existence as compared to non-existence, I don't think that comes at the beginning. That's a very sophisticated, advanced idea. Consciousness as a state versus consciousness as a faculty. Those are also two different things. So I would argue that, and there's certain aspects of the axioms, that start at the beginning. But I would argue even our understanding of axiomatic concepts is subject to a spiral of knowledge. I'm saying this a little bit off the top of my head. I'm open to being,
Yeah.
argued out of that, but not with causality, because causality, that one, well, I guess you can argue, I'll listen to any argument, right? But what I just said applies to causality according to my theory.
Great. So now let me proceed to my next. I've sort of changed the order of my questioning now that I've learned some of the stuff, some of your answers.
Yeah.
And I have objections to your particular hierarchy. But before we get to that, I want to talk about your approach to hierarchy as opposed to Peikoff's approach, which I find kind of more interesting than those, because this is kind of a side issue. Only once we've established that your approach to hierarchy is right, does it make sense to actually go into any objections I have about how you actually set it up. And I suspect I do agree with your approach to hierarchy.
Okay.
Because you're saying that now correct me if I'm wrong, you're interested in what could be characterized as an ordered inductive validation of knowledge. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And it
Now,
has inductive aspects, it has deductive aspects, it has what I sometimes call an analytical aspect, of breaking something down, right? So for instance, when you look at an instance of consciousness, you break down the participants in that in that physical action. There's an existence, and then there's a consciousness, right? And for any instance of consciousness, you need two things, right? You need something you're conscious of, and then the thing that's conscious. So that's an analysis already, because we're taking a conscious state and we're breaking it into its parts, and then we can notice certain things about each part.
Right. But it's inductive all the way through, insofar as first of all, you're noticing things from sense perception, and then not necessarily conceptualizing but them, because it's the early stages, but you are using our adult concepts to gesture towards those things we are aware of at the beginning.
That's right.
So that's a straight induction. You're just looking at reality and becoming aware of it. But then I would say that even the deductions and the analyses are still inductive, because you only ever deduce from things that were induced earlier,
Well,
and you only ever analyze using what's been induced earlier. So all of this is all of this sort of falls under the umbrella of induction, because it's inductive in its essence, is the way I would think of it.
yeah. Well, sometimes you can analyze, though, an instance of your awareness, a perceptual fact. Would you say that that is still an inductive step? Like my just noticing, reality out there and seeing this object, would you call that induction too?
I would call it induction insofar as it follows the principle of logical inductive order, that you only analyze things that have been established inductively. And similarly, you only deduce from prior concepts which have been established inductively, or which have been established through induction and prior deductions. So to me, it all kind of falls under induction. Like deduction, while following the rules of induction, deduction then becomes a valid part of the inductive process, because you have to use deduction to become aware of certain kinds of things, because a lot of things are not immediately perceivable. So
yeah,
okay, yeah.
I would say it a little differently. I would make a separate category for our sensory awareness. Of course, that our sensory awareness is an integral part, or a necessary part of a whole inductive process. But I would not call that sensory awareness itself induction. But
I think I agree with you there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'd have to think about how exactly to change my formulation there, but I prefer to move on. So,
sure.
I think that's a good thing for me to think about later. So, so you wanted to have a different hierarchy because it seemed, and tell me if you agree with this, you wanted to do the hierarchy differently than the way Peikoff did it, because it seemed to you like that was not a inductive development. Is that it didn't make sense to you as an inductive ordered validation?
Well, it did not make sense as an inductive thing. It did not make sense as a deductive thing. It did not make sense. I did not find it convincing. So my approach was just that, gee, I read this argument in a book. I was not convinced. And a friend of mine, my friend Glenn Marcus, was also not convinced. He's the one who read it first when the book first came out. He was a little ahead of me. And he's the one who instigated for me to write. I said, what do you want me to do? Write a book on philosophy? And he said, yeah, yes.
Yeah, do it.
So then I started with a blank piece of paper. Then I put aside what I learned from Ayn Rand and Peikoff, and I started over. And that was all. So yeah, that's all I had to say about that.
Interesting. Okay, so now Peikoff mentions in the lecture Objectivism Through Induction, Peikoff mentions a difference between what he calls the OPAR hierarchy and the Objectivism Through Induction hierarchy. He doesn't go into too much detail about this, but he acknowledges a difference. And in a sense, he has to acknowledge the difference because his treatment in OTI is different from the treatment in OPAR. So if both of these are hierarchies, then I mean, he's sort of answering the natural question, like, how could this be a hierarchy? And then how could OPAR also be a hierarchy? And he explicitly says in all of his lectures leading up to OPAR, and I believe in OPAR itself, that this is hierarchically ordered. And so, um, so, but what he sort of seems to be hinting at here, or an implication of what he's saying here, is that the inductive order is different from the OPAR hierarchy. Now, something I have been very interested in for a while, about 3 years now, is that I do think that the OPAR order has significance, but I don't think it's an inductive order. I think what you're attempting, I'm not sure if you achieve it, but you are attempting an actual inductive order of first philosophy. I don't know if you'd necessarily call it that, but sort of philosophical. I mean, it's an inductive validation of knowledge, and the hierarchy is an inductive order.
Well, it relies on observation.
Yeah,
as
and
its first step of everything, right? So I broke down causality just before into 3 parts, and each part has some kind of observations connected with it. The first part has just observing any instance of our sensory awareness. The second part is dealing with our awareness of entities, our perceptual awareness. And, I argue that the very fact that we perceive entities is our most basic and extensive and voluminous evidence for causality, for the fact that our knowledge that reality acts in a regular, persistent, consistent way, and so that fleshes out the law of identity. So again, it's relating to those facts. And then in my third step, I do some more thinking, right? And I introduce methods of induction, but it builds on that evidence that I presented earlier. So if that's what you mean, yeah, that is what I do. Now it's not like I set out to say I want to do this inductively. I set out to arrive at a validation that convinced me, and I used whatever tools that I thought were, that I found. And my approach is different from both of the 2 methods that you've pointed out. That yes, the Peikoff's does differ in OPAR versus objectivism through induction. He absolutely does. And I think even in the book by Harriman, that's a third method, and all 3 of them differ. I'm not convinced by any of them. That's
interesting.
That's why I've done. Now I worked on my approach before Peikoff's book, or Peikoff's lectures, which became Harriman's book, came out. I had the basics of my theory already before that, but my theory is different from that one. My theory is different from all 3 of the others. Now I don't make any claim that my way is the only way. And if you have a way to shore up Peikoff's approach in OPAR, I'm all for hearing that. It can be many roads to Rome, and this goes to the meaning of hierarchy in the first place, or an order. Hierarchy and order is a little different, right? Hierarchy is a certain kind of order. It usually suggests a one-to-many relationship, building, like in an org chart, or something that gets very broad. Whereas an order is this thing, then this thing, then this thing. But either way, as we know, our method of learning things about reality can take different paths, right? As you point out, is basic to your work. So my way being valid does not preclude you finding a way to make valid Peikoff's overall strategy in that book. I did not see a way to do it that way, but it could be 20 different ways. My book is called A Validation of Knowledge, not
The validation. Yeah. Right.
right?
Yeah. That makes sense. Now, so one thing, so here's what I suspect what's going on in OPAR, and maybe you can shed light on this. I think I think perhaps the reason you found OPAR unconvincing, at least in its ordering, in its particular ordering of validation, I suspect the reason you found it unconvincing is because I suspect that that's not really what it is or what it was ever really supposed to be. I suspect that OPAR is what I would call a conditional hierarchy. And what I mean by this is it's not an order of induction. What it is instead is a hierarchy of knowledge, and where the higher elements, let's say, or the earlier elements, play a role in the identity of the later elements. So the fact that existence exists, that is a fact that plays a role in all other facts. The fact that that everything has its everything is what it is, that everything has identity, that plays a role. Consciousness, the fact that consciousness is conscious, that plays a role in our grasp of all other facts. So if you interpret it my way, you actually have a different view of these axioms. You actually have a separate. If you view it my way, I don't think this is an aspect of OPAR at all. This is if you interpret OPAR my way. The third axiom of consciousness would actually have a different kind of status, is that it applies to all of our knowledge of reality, whereas the first two axioms apply to all of reality as such. And my point right now here is that this is a very different kind of order. It's an order of which facts play a role in which other facts, not how each fact allows you to know the next fact. And that's your order. Your order is an attempt to, we'll see if I agree with it, but I agree with the intention, which is the attempt to make it so each earlier fact it forms the foundation for how you know the next fact. And so it's a validation. But what I would say OPAR is not a validation. It's a certain kind of systematization. And even though it doesn't achieve a validation, I think it is still a very important work that the ordering is not a mistake. The ordering serves a very real purpose. It's a purpose that's different from your ordering, but it's a very important purpose. Here's the purpose. It's if you present your facts, if you present your pieces of knowledge in this conditioning order, then you are able to see the later facts in the light of the earlier facts. And the reason why this is particularly important is because if you see the later facts in the light of the earlier facts, then you're able to understand more about those later facts. So a simple example of this is if you understand capitalism in a way which is conditioned by, or it's seen in the light of, egoism, then you have a more refined, you have a different concept of capitalism than that of a libertarian. I think libertarians, barring like the crazy ones like anarchists and stuff like that, I think libertarians, say like John Stossel, I think they truly know some stuff about liberty. They know that people live better when they're free. They know that we have more economic progress when people are free. They know a ton, but they haven't seen it in the light of ethics because they don't really understand egoism. And therefore they can't understand capitalism in the light of egoism. And so what does OPAR do for us? It allows us it allows us to fully integrate objectivism. If you read this book from front to back and you really get it, or maybe you got to read it a few times to really get it, then every piece of the system is seen in the light of all the other pieces which condition its identity. So this allows you to have a fully integrated understanding of each piece. And that's so important, but it's not a validation. It's not a proof. Proof is inductive. Proof is inductive. It's not like this, which like, it's not to diss the book, it's not to devalue it, it's just not doing a validation, it's doing a systematization, I think. Now the thing is, though, if you listen to Peikoff in some of the lectures, especially the lectures leading up to OPAR, state of the art and understanding objectivism, when he talks about hierarchy in both of these lectures, it's as though it really seems as though he thinks he's validating it, proving it, even inductively doing it. But then later he says that in OTI, it's different from the OPAR order. So he seems to be aware of this issue later, but he doesn't follow up on it. So I actually had a video at one point where I point this out fully. I point this out and criticize OPAR on these grounds, but I ended up taking it down because I thought about it again and then got confused as to whether I'm right or not. But what I've just told you is a pretty clear statement of what I think about this so far. So any comments on that from you?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure I understand you. So let me try to put in my words what I think you said, and I'm sympathetic to that. That there's got to be a process of validation. These ideas. Once you have that process of validation, you arrive at a general and important and extremely valuable principle. Let's say, for instance, entities act in accordance with their nature. Now, I would say that that's not something you can validate on page 10. That's something that took my whole book to validate. But once you know that's true, now you can put that at the base of your hierarchy. And it helps you see in a much better perspective everything else you know. It helps you systematize, organize, streamline, and make conducive for more learning a tremendous amount. You've now put that as your new guide for understanding the world, or a big part of your new guide. If that's what you're driving at, I think that's absolutely right, and that goes to why we want to learn philosophy, because and the history of thought abounds with these kinds of examples, right? So, for instance, Aristotle was not the first human to use logic, right? But he observed that other people had used logic to reach conclusions, and he systematized it. So now, once you know Aristotle's laws of logic, you can now insert that at a much, in other words, it came very late. The laws of logic came late in a chronology, let's say. But then once you know it, you can insert it much earlier and use it much more effectively. And it can replace other rules of thumb that you might have had, and put that at its base. So so there's another example, I think, of what you're saying. You must have, many examples in physics. I gave a simple example in, something like discovering oil, which is not as terrific an example, maybe. And what was another one that I was driving at, or thinking of? But anyway, there's an example, right? The laws of logic. So
So two examples you would give of this phenomenon would be the development and then the later application of Aristotle's laws of logic. And then a second example would be your oil example, where first there's maybe like a chain of inference that allows the engineer to know that there's oil at a certain location. Then there's perception in the light of chemical knowledge. Oh, look at this, it's black, it lights on fire, etc. Like, okay, yeah, it's oil. There's two. Okay, I'm not sure how I follow how the oil example is an example of that.
The second one is not is on point to your approach, because your approach is more that you're identifying some fundamental idea that now fits in at a more basic spot in your hierarchy that you use for gaining new knowledge. And I think the laws of logic is a much more parallel example to your example of, let's say, the law of identity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So go
ahead. I would disagree with one small aspect of how you said it earlier. It's small but important, I think, which is you said, I liked your progression. You said you learn some things, then you learn some higher level things, then you apply those higher level things to the lower level things. And you said something about something like, so for example, causality, or let's say the laws, your example you gave is the laws of logic come later, but then you realize that the laws of logic apply to all of this earlier stuff.
That's
and the
right.
way you said that is that you then put the laws of logic first in a certain way. And like, I would simply say that there's just two different orderings. There's the ordering of the logical order of induction. Then there's the order of what you might call fundamentality. And logic is, and the laws of logic are at the beginning of or near the beginning anyway, of the order of fundamentality, whereas they are later in the logical inductive order, is the way I'd put it.
Maybe. I'm open to being convinced of that. I'd have to think about that. I said something myself that I thought maybe I shouldn't have said it that way. Chronology is not really the issue, right?
Yes, that's right.
Chronological order is a whole other matter, and I'm trying, in my book, I tried to avoid a reliance on chronology.
Yeah, and neither of us are really interested in any particular chronology.
Yeah,
we're interested in the logical order.
Mm-hmm.
And any given logical order must be a possible, valid chronology. But chronology as such, the order in which you happen to learn things, that's not super important. What we're interested in is the valid order of learning.
Yeah, well, so I'm open, and of course, in principle, we know that there, as we say, there can be many roads to Rome, and there certainly can be, that for giving a mathematical proof, right, or a geometric proof, how many different proofs of the Pythagorean theorem are there, right? Mm-hmm. And which one is more fundamental? Well, it's maybe hard to say, right? So there's nothing to say that something has to go in only one order. And if you've identified two different orders that serve different purposes, that's great.
Yes, I see. Different orders that serve different purposes. Yeah, so actually an example of this would be your petroleum engineer example. The order of learning that oil is at a certain location. One order is useful for inferring the location of oil when you can't see it. Then the other one is the order you want when the oil's right there and you can literally look at it and burn it, and it's right there to be tested. It's
Mhm.
different. Maybe I'm not sure if that's exactly the same issue, but
No,
um,
it's
I'm not. Yeah.
specific, yeah. But you know, for instance, in math, there are sometimes different ways to define certain concepts, right? So a parabola can be defined in terms of, you know, an equation, right? In two dimensions, with that it's the curve described by some quadratic equation.
Mm-hmm.
And it could also be described in terms of being a certain kind of conic section.
Yeah.
It could also be defined in terms of a distance from the the curve, the points on the curve to a directrix,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And there could be benefits for any one of those depending on your application. I'm sympathetic to what you're saying about OPAR.
Mm-hmm.
I would add though that that's what my book tried to do. It tried to validate
Yeah.
concepts such as entities act in accordance to their nature. So yes, so that we could use that principle in a fundamental way.
Use it in a fundamental way. What does that
Yeah,
mean?
so that words came out of my mouth. I was asking that question too, as I said.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But in other words, it's something that you can, I'm just thinking out loud,
Yeah.
but something that you can resort to very early on in an analysis. Like it took a lot to understand that that is true, but once you have it, you can call on it right away, and it's very broad in its application.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very broad,
The,
but it's got to be validated.
yeah.
It's well. Here's another analogy. Tell me what you think of this one. Copernicus was remarkably right about a lot, right? But then it took Newton to validate it.
Mm, in what
What do you think?
particular way do you mean? Because I think Copernicus, well, in my inductive summaries of physics, at least the fictional way I present Copernicus, he fully inductively proves quite a number of things. He does not, of course, prove gravity. I think, at least in my stories, he proves that the sun is doing something to the planets to make them move. He can't know any of the specifics. Kepler, he doesn't even know Kepler's laws of motion. Like, how is it? What are the patterns specifically? But he does know for a fact, I think, that this, at least in my narrative, I didn't look too hard at literally what Copernicus did at any stage, but I think he knew, or at least in the narrative, that the sun acts on the planets. I will raise so that now I definitely think we're on the same page with regard to what you're trying to achieve and the fact that it's a thing worth achieving. And then I have some questions about whether this is a way to do it, because I do have some objections to the validation of causality. And so I'll bring that up next time.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Cool. And I really appreciate you taking the time, Ron. This
Oh,
is
my
really
pleasure.
educational. Yeah.
Yeah, likewise.
So that was my first conversation with Ron Pisaturo about his book. I expect there to be more conversations like it. And once again, if you want to buy Ron's book, you can find a link to it in the description below. Thanks for watching.